Hello, my name is Glenda Guion. I am a ceramic artist and a retired teacher. I want to thank Sarah Murphy for inviting me to present to you today. Um, as a visual artist, my presentations are typically showing slides of my work and talking about the work instead of just talking about myself. So this is my first video. Be kind. Don't critique too harshly. Sarah gave me a list of questions. I've tried to answer them, just telling you my story about my career. So I don't ever remember wanting to be anything other than an artist. And when I was little and people would say, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I would say an artist. And eventually I learned that um, that terrified look on their face made sense. And I'm sure my parents were terrified at the thought of me becoming a starving artist for a career. Um, when I was growing up, we would go to my grandmother's house, and she had oil paintings in every room of her house. And it was much later that I learned that she had done those paintings when she was a teenager, before my father was born in 1918. So I now have all those paintings hanging in my house. There's one on either side of me right now. And I still look at them in awe that my little 5 foot nothing grandmother painted those with no training whatsoever. She lived on a farm surrounded by hundreds of acres of tobacco fields. And I would stare at those paintings and think, I'm going to be a painter when I grow up, not having a clue what that meant. Um, she painted landscapes and flowers and campground scenes, and she earned all her money to buy her paints and canvases by tutoring her younger brother. She also sewed most of my clothes when I was little, and then she'd use the leftover fabric and sew my Barbie doll a matching outfit. My parents would send me to stay with her for a week every summer, and she baked the best chocolate chip cookies and yeast rolls. And every year she made me a birthday cake with pink roses on top. She grew a rose garden, raised chickens, sold eggs. Anyway, she was incredibly talented, incredibly creative, although she would have never used that word to describe herself. So I was born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee, before Nashville became hip. And my parents' next door neighbors were artists. Mildred Ansley was a well known portrait painter in Nashville and painted portraits of college presidents and business executives. She had people would come to her house to sit to have their portrait done, and she had a small studio that was a converted bedroom. And I just thought that was so cool to have a real art studio. Her husband, Jack, was a shoe designer for Genesco CoverGirl shoes, and they just seemed like the happiest, most creative couple that I ever met, and still top of the list. Um, Mildred would take painting workshops across the country and be gone for a week. Jack carved African style masks and they hung on the wooden fence in their backyard. So those were my two inspirations when I was small and growing up. At this time in the 60s and the 70s, there were like three television stations in Nashville in my parents' house. There was no internet, and the only other exposure that I had to art was from a set of encyclopedias or any books that I could find in the library and take home. But I knew I wanted to be an artist, and my mom would buy me those paint by number kits, and I'd use the paint real thin so that I would have a lot left over in the little pots. And then I'd do my own paintings, and I'd take them over to Mildred and ask her for a critique. And she was really kind and supportive. And I know they were terrible, but I think she was excited that I wanted to be an artist someday. So I took art history or art and home economics every year in middle school through high school. And I learned art history and I learned how to sew and cook. And I was not the greatest academic student in my youth. And so I'm really grateful that I had those classes. They kind of saved me growing up. and I'd fight for art programs till the day I die. My high school art teacher, Miss Scales, who I loved and admired, entered my work into a couple of high school art exhibits at Belmont College and Middle Tennessee State University. And then she took us on field trips to see those shows. And I was so amazed to see my art hanging in a real gallery. It was very inspirational. But I didn't want to go to college straight out of high school. I wasn't sure I was college material, and I really didn't even know what that meant. I didn't know, only had heard of three schools that had art programs at that time. So I took a year off and I worked as a drive in bank teller in Nashville. And by the end of that year, I figured if this is not what I want to do for the rest of my life, I'd better go to college. So I applied to MTSU and declared my major as visual art. After the first year of 2D design, 3D design, drawing, all those basic classes that you have to get through, I was required to declare a major and two minors. And clay was going to be one of my minors until I took the class, and I had never worked in clay at all. And after that one class, I decided that's it. I'm going to be a potter. So that's what I studied. And then in my junior year, I was hit by a car while I was riding a bicycle, and I flew off the car and hit my shoulder and my hip, and I couldn't throw on the wheel anymore. So I dropped out of college, moved to Florida, took a job working in a little commercial ceramic shop for a crusty old retired naval officer. And some days I just stood in a small room in Florida with no air conditioning, sanding the seams off of pottery that had been made in molds. And then eventually I was promoted to macrame teacher. In the late 70s, macrame plant hangers were really big. And I hear that my macrame is kind of making a comeback now. So don't laugh. After a year in Florida, I was ready to go back to Tennessee. I had heard that a local potter, Lewis Snyder, was looking to hire someone to work in his studio. He was well known in Murfreesboro and Tennessee uh, because he had made a set of dishes for Jimmy and Rosalind Carter when they were living in the White House. So I went and interviewed with him, and he actually gave me the job, but I was broke, and his salary was going to be based on how many pots I could make a day. And I hadn't thrown pottery in over a year because of my injury, and I wasn't sure that I could produce enough to make a living. So I turned down the job and I went to work for a local bank in Murfreesboro. I already knew how to be a teller. So they hired me as head teller, and I took the job with a steady income. For whatever reason, I kept getting promoted at this small bank. First to credit card manager, and then branch manager, and then bank officer. And I even took banking classes, which I had totally forgotten about until I recently found them buried in the bottom of a box. Found the certificates from those classes. So I stayed much longer than I had ever planned. Anyway, as a single woman in 1983, I'd bought my own home, and it looked like I had kind of a normal, steady life, but it was not a life that I had ever planned. So I started taking night classes at MTSU, first in photography and then painting, and then I audited a class in clay. And after 5 years as a banker, I quit and I enrolled again as a full-time student and took a job at a small frame shop, framing prints and artwork that people brought in. When I went back to college, I wanted to try everything. And I think that's important when you're a student because you might not ever have the opportunity again to work in so many different studios and with so many different masters of their field. And so I double majored in painting and clay and ended up liking one credit from having a third major in sculpture. Just couldn't get enough. I started hand building with clay, instead of throwing pottery. And at first I was making functional pieces like cups and bowls and um, work like I'd been making before. And then the work just started getting more and more abstract until finally it just became pure sculpture. My professor, Peter McDougall, helped me look at graduate programs, but at that time I was not willing to go far from Tennessee. My parents were older. I felt I needed to be able to get home in a drive within a short period of time. So I also knew that after taking so many years off, that I didn't want to take any time off between undergraduate and graduate school. So I applied to 5 graduate programs and got in all of them. And I chose Clemson because the teacher there, Mike Vadalero, had done a workshop at MTSU. And he was an Alfred grad, and Alfred is one of the best clay programs in the country. And I knew I wasn't going to go all the way to upstate New York to go to graduate school. So I figured that I could get a second generation Alfred education by studying with my undergraduate teacher, Peter, who went there, and with Mike, as silly as that may sound today. So I sold my house and I left a whole different world behind to move to South Carolina to go to graduate school. In Tennessee, I couldn't go out my front door without running into someone that I knew, either from growing up there or working in the bank or going to college. And I had to start from scratch. I moved there and didn't move to South Carolina, didn't know a single person. And I think I cried every day for the first 6 months that I was there. But I was able to go into the studio and work for hours and hours and hours. And I had to keep reminding myself that that was the reason that I went there. Because I'd worked for years before I went back to college, I was lucky to have a small amount of savings. And when I went to graduate school, I had a full scholarship and a teaching assistantship with a small stipend that came with it. So when I left school, I was debt free, which I know is rare and hard for people, especially nowadays, to make happen. But I didn't take the typical route. When I graduated with my MFA, I didn't have a job, and that savings account was pretty much gone. So once again, I needed a job. And one of my professors told me about an opportunity to work with a couple that were artists, that are artists still, a potter named Jamie Davis and his wife, Ellen Kachansky, who is a fiber artist. In the 80s, they traveled the country, participating in big craft fairs, and they both had gallery representation and lots of commissions. So I helped Jamie make his clay work, and eventually I helped Ellen sew her fiber art, so that home economics, all those home economics classes finally paid off doing that. Um, I lived in a room off of their studio with a dorm refrigerator and a microwave and a twin bed for about a year. I was also teaching night classes and summer school at the Greenville County Art Museum School. At that time, USC had connected with the museum to offer college credit through their classes. And most of my students were older than me, and many of them were teachers taking classes working toward their teaching recertification or their master's degrees. While I was there, the director of the museum school, Sharon Campbell, told me about a job that had come open at a school called the Fine Arts Center, where her husband was the painting teacher there. So far, I had teaching experience of teaching 2 summers of summer school at a school called the Webb School in Tennessee while I was in undergraduate school, and then 5 semesters of teaching graduate teaching assistantships and 4 courses for the museum. Not the greatest resume to interview with, but I went anyway. The Fine Arts Center was not in the best part of town. The building was empty because it was in the summer, and the studio space was in an the old converted library room. And so I really couldn't get a grasp on what the place was about. And I remember going back to Ellen and saying, I wasn't sure I'd take the job if I got it. So I took the job and I ended up teaching there for 25 years. And for 13 of those years, I was also the department chair of the um, art department for 13 years. The Fine Arts Center is a magnet school that started in 1974, and the students come from 16 different high schools across the county for 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. And they have to send in an application and come in and have a portfolio review, or if they're in music, they have to have an audition. And so at that time, it was mostly juniors and seniors. The school offers classes in visual art, dance, music, theater, creative writing. Excuse me. And it's one of only a handful of programs like that that are actually left in the country. It ended up being the perfect fit for me. I got to work with creative faculty and creative students. I got to help students have some advice toward art career, which is something I wish I could have had a little bit when I was growing up. And eventually, the school moved into a brand new state-of-the-art building on the campus of Wade Hampton High School. And I had the opportunity to totally design the new fabulous clay studio that's there. And actually, Sarah Murphy, who asked me to do this, and Professor Mary Carlisle are both two of my former students, former great students. Over the years, I watched students go on to become teachers and artists and architects and glass blowers and have jobs in museums and work for Google and even the Wall Street Journal. So not all of them wanted to be in ceramics when they first applied to come to the Fine Arts Center. Everybody wants to be in drawing because that's what they've done in the past. But every year we would require them to take a 2D and a 3D area so that they would have an experience more like the real world, not just come in and do what they already knew how to do, but to learn something and push themselves. I came to South Carolina to go to college, and I never thought I'd stay in South Carolina. And 40 years ago, I thought I'd be living somewhere else, but never really had a plan where that would be. I never found a city and said, oh, that's where I've got to live someday. For me, I was happy being in a smaller city, and I'm happy that I was able to contribute to the growth of Greenville's art scene. Because the Fine Arts Center is connected to the Greenville County school system, I was presented with all kinds of projects to do for the community, and they were sometimes challenging and they were fun. I was asked to help my students make a clay tile mural for the Greenville Zoo reptile building. And I worked with my students to build a 3-story high clay fish mobile, these big, huge clay fish flying in the air with glass at the top of the space. And so that was pretty intimidating, but they offered my program $5,000 if we would do it. And I ended up learning so much from taking that on. Everything from going and wearing a hard hat while they were building the space to see the colors of the floor tiles, to working with an installation crew who were putting it in, riding a cherry picker bucket to get it up high in the air. So I was lucky to have a day job that included art. There were times when I resented the amount of time that had to be spent in meetings and on paperwork. There were many days that I went home way too tired to work on my own work. But I love teaching, and I can't imagine that another job that I could have done. For me, I really haven't had so much to balance a professional, artistic, and personal life. They were all connected. And there will always be things that will take you away from making your art if you let them. You have to decide what your goals are. I think an In an artist's life, it's important to find a job and a partner who will let you be yourself. I didn't meet my husband until I was 34 years old. I'm a little bit of a slow starter. And he came as a visiting writer to the Fine Arts Center. His work requires lots of hours of alone time, and my work requires hours of alone time. So it was a really good match for us for almost 30 years now. And we don't compete, and we try to support each other in our fields and our lives. Living with a writer, I watched him send off stories constantly, and as soon as he would get a story rejected, he would just put it in an envelope and mail it somewhere else. He now has 12 books published, 9 collections of short stories, 2 novels, and a book on writing help. I saw all the rejections that came before, and I saw that he never gave up, even never stopped writing, no matter how many people rejected his story. I first began entering local shows while I was still in college, and I've had my share of rejections, plenty. Having my work seen in shows and attending openings helped me to make connections with other artists, and it also led to having solo shows and eventually, group invitationals. All of that started working after getting in some of the local and regional juried shows. Early on, I was also willing to show my work in unconventional places. When I first moved to Greenville in the late 80s, there were lots of empty storefronts on Main Street in Greenville, and artists were able to connect with the owners and put up temporary shows in those storefronts. And the first large piece that I ever sold was out of one of those empty storefronts. I hung my work in the lobby of a landscape architect. It was just about getting my work out there so it could be seen. I was always surprised when it sold. I'm still surprised and happy when it sells. Having a steady paycheck meant that I didn't have to rely on just selling, and I could make the work that I wanted to make. I know it's not what everybody wants, but it was best for me. And actually, when I would have my studio open to visitors and people would ask me if I would make them a soap dish, it was an opportunity for me to pass on names of other clay artists that I knew that could do a better job than me, so I could help support other people. Once I started building my resume, I got brave and started entering national jury shows. And within a couple of years, I'd been in about 10. And then at one time, I had 3 solo shows, and I had been making all of my slabs of clay by hand. And I needed a piece of equipment called a slab roller. So I applied for a grant through the local arts, Arts Council. Sorry. And asked for $500 for the slab roller and for entry fees for entering other shows. And that little grant bought me one of the most important pieces of equipment that I have and that I still use today. Then I sold an article that I wrote to a magazine, and it was an article about the fish mobile that I had made with my student. And the money that I got from that, I used to buy an extruder for my studio. So I've tried over the years to use my art income to help build my studio and enter shows and buy materials, put all that money back into my art. Starting a clay studio is really expensive, and I was lucky to have facilities at my job, but I wanted a studio at home so I could work in quiet and work whenever I wanted to. Other ways that I built my resume was from looking at magazines and article ads in the back of magazines for calls for juried shows to enter. And at one time I saw an ad from a publishing house that was going to write a book on hand-built ceramics. So I sent in my slides, and they accepted 2 of my images for the book. And then a couple of years later, I saw that they were going to write a book called 500 Teapots, and I sent in images, and they chose 3 to be included in that book. Excuse me. I didn't talk much during the pandemic. So I want to talk about these teapots for a minute. I've been making these large-scale teapots that were based off of the shape of old metal watering cans, tin watering cans that I collected. I'd been making all these real serious, large sculptural pieces, and I just wanted to do something for fun. Not serious, just fun. And I made about 30 of them and sold them all, and I've never made another one. And they got in that book. And it wasn't just a lark. I had worked hard for many years, but it was a really nice surprise to be recognized for doing something that I did as a kind of reboot for my other artwork. You never know what will come from trying something different. Teaching allowed me to have summers off and to continue to take workshops and study. And I studied with a Tiwa Native American Indian woman on the Taos Reservation in New Mexico for a week. I took a workshop with the artist Bill Daly, and in a week I learned more new methods than I had in years that changed my work forever. Something as simple as using a wood rasp to shape the clay, or a heat gun. Those things were a revelation. And again, this was before the internet, where you can now watch a video on how to do anything. But watching videos are never going to replace working with human beings, hands-on. Bill was in his 70s, and he stayed in the studio with us all day, and then came back at night for those of us that just couldn't get enough and wanted to work till 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And his kindness and energy and instruction were inspirational to me and have stayed with me forever. At one time, I wrote a grant to go to study with Dolores and Emma Lewis, who are the daughters of the Acoma Pueblo matriarch and one of the most famous Acoma potters. Even though I wasn't making pottery, what I learned from them was once-in-a-lifetime experience. The $5,000 grant money allowed me to drive all over New Mexico and visit reservations and Mesa Verde and study Pueblo pottery, and then spend 5 days in the workshop with the Lewis sisters. A year later, they paid for me to go to New York to give a presentation about the experience with all the other teachers who had received the grant. So this is a good place to talk about how I deal with failure. I applied and was rejected for that grant 2 times before I finally got it. And if I had given up, I would have really missed out. I'm just stubborn enough, got a hair somewhere, to keep trying. And maybe on that 3rd try, they said, well, we need to go ahead and give it to her because we're going to have to read a grant from her every year if we don't. So don't quit trying. Don't give up on that first rejection. When my failure comes from being rejected from a juried art show, I'll pout and rationalize for about a minute, and then I move on. A piece rejected by one show can easily be accepted in another. And I've never wanted to quit just because of being rejected. My motive for making work has never been about competition or sales. If I'm rejected from a show, I look at the artwork made by the juror, or the other artwork that was selected, and I can usually figure out why I was not included. So now I even try to look at the jurors' work and background before I even enter shows, because it's expensive to enter those shows. I've been working with clay long enough now that I don't worry so much about my artwork being a failure. If it's something that's not working for me while I'm building a piece, I fix it before I keep going on, because if it's not good at one stage, it's not going to get better if you don't fix it. I haven't had anything blow up in many years, so I'm lucky on that. But I still have things that will crack from time to time, but I know how to fix them, and I know how to paint, and I can sometimes even make the piece more interesting from that mistake. I've never been good at networking. I'm a dinosaur. I know that. My networking has been from working hard, going to art shows, teaching, being willing to put my artwork out there anywhere I could and let it represent me. I've always tried to be honest and trustworthy with other artists and art organizations, and I try to support other artists um, willing to share ideas and techniques. I know that there have been potters over the years that would never give up their secret glaze recipe, but that's not me. So the world is so different now with Instagram, Facebook, blogs, websites, everything else that it's easy to be overwhelmed if you're not into self promotion. But I absolutely understand the need to promote, and you'll have to decide how much networking you're willing to do. If you don't produce large volumes of work every year that can support selling online or through galleries, then you'll have to find another way to do it, and a website can be good for that. Also, you can look for other group of artists to connect with and become part of, depending on where you end up living after you graduate. The advantage is that you'll have access to other creative people and studio equipment and space that you might not have otherwise. Um, Shows that are put on by groups. The disadvantage is you can overcommit and it can actually distract you from making your own artwork. So you have to find your tribe, the right people to do that with. I've been involved with a number of artists groups over the years, and I need interaction with other creative minds. You don't talk art with people in the grocery store. For instance, I was one of the original artists that helped start the Greenville studio tours and helped chair that event for 4 years. Uh, but I live in Spartanburg now, so that's not a part of what I do anymore. Uh, so every time you leave a community, you're going to have to find a new community of people that will inspire and support your art. So one question that Sarah sent me was, how has your gender impacted your professional life? I guess in some ways I was dumb and I didn't realize that I was being treated any differently because I was a woman. Um, I've always done and moved ahead with just whatever I wanted to do. And I'm sure there were times that there were opportunities that I didn't get because I was a woman, but I never really looked at it that way. And I think that's because my early uh, artistic support came from women, from my grandmother, from Mildred Ansley, from my mother, who was really strong willed. She wrote poetry. She marched in protests during the 60s and 70s. My father supported most of that. Uh, so when I was in the third grade, we were going to have pioneer school, pioneer day at school. And I volunteered my mother to make lye soap because I was sure she knew how to do it. She knew how to do everything. I don't know how she figured out how to. She didn't know how to make lye soap, um, and I still don't know how she figured it out. But she came to school with a big copper kettle and made a batch of lye soap, and every child went home with a piece of it, and all the leftovers set up in our attic for years and years. Um, but I never questioned that she couldn't do something, and that's who raised me. I've never let my gender influence what I want to do. I own a chainsaw and use it. Recently, I replaced the flush valve in our toilet. I've reupholstered chairs and went on the internet and learned how to make double welting. And, I know how to sew. What I'm saying is, you will decide um, what your creative life is going to look like. With information of how to do almost anything on the internet now, I figure I'll watch a video of how to fix a toilet. And if I get into it and I can't do it, then I'll call somebody to come take care of my mess. But I've never been scared to at least try something that I've never done before. Okay, the last few questions I'm going to read because I don't think I really touched on them um, in what I've said earlier. But what did you know when you wish you knew when you entered your field? And I kind of wish I'd known that becoming an artist was not going to be just a job of just painting in the studio all day and going to cafes at night kind of myth of it. That you really would have to know how to write and how to keep financial records and figure out a way to have a job to pay your bills. All that's not gonna come early on typically. And I wish I had known. I thought the business world was competitive, but the art world can be super competitive, and there are people out there that are way more competitive in it than I have been. And if I could give advice to my college age self, I would say not to take everything so personally. Um, I wore my heart on my sleeve a lot, and to trust my gut because not everybody's going to give you great feedback or advice. Also, I was a little bit embarrassed to be an older student when I went back to college because um, somehow in my mind I thought I was a failure for when I was there with all these smart students that had come straight out of college and knew what they wanted to do, and that wasn't true. I ended up being a great academic student finally because I really wanted it. I wanted to learn. I made an A in biology, and I'm not sure anybody would have ever guessed that back when I was in biology in high school. So you have to learn that you don't have to follow the path of what so-called normal people do and what's expected of you. If you really want it, you'll find a way to get there. So I think the last question here is, how do you deal with uncertainty and self-doubt? And I am probably my harshest critic, but I'm going to read you a quote from the artist Georgia O'Keeffe, and I think probably all of you know who Georgia O'Keeffe was, a famous painter, female painter from New Mexico. And the quote is, "I have been absolutely terrified every moment of my life, and I've never let it stop me from doing a single thing I wanted to do." And if I can leave you with anything today, um, that would be it. And that I hope you will not let fear or fear of failure stop you from doing what you want to do. And I wish you great success in your artistic, creative lives. And I hope that you'll be surprised with what's going to happen if you follow your passion. So thank you for listening to me today, and see you later.